I spent 35 years as an electrician so my son could become a doctor. I skipped vacations, drove the same truck for 14 years, and nursed his mother through her final illness alone so he wouldn't lose focus on his studies. Then his wife called to tell me I wasn't educated enough to attend the opening of the practice I helped build. What happened after that changed both of us in ways neither of us expected. I am 61 years old. I have calloused hands and a bad left knee and a pension I've been building since before my son was born. I have lived in the same house in the same neighborhood for 27 years. I know my neighbors by name and their dogs by name, and in most cases the dogs' names are better than the neighbors. I'm not a man who writes about his feelings on the internet. I have written in my adult life, work invoices, a eulogy for my wife, and one very firm letter to my county assessor about a property tax error that turned out to be my own mistake, which I had the dignity to acknowledge in a follow-up letter. I am writing this because I need it outside of my head, because what happened over the last 14 months has been the kind of thing that changes the shape of a person, and I'm still in the process of understanding what shape I have become. And because my neighbor Cliff, who is 73 and has seen most things, told me last week that I should write it down. He said, "Ray, some things need to be said out loud before they stop eating you." So here I am, saying it out loud. My name is Raymond. My son's name is Daniel. And this is the full story of how I almost gave away the last useful thing I had. Not my money, though that was part of it, but my self-respect. And what happened when I finally stopped. I want to start with my hands, because I think they tell you something important. I became a licensed electrician at 23. Went through a 4-year apprenticeship, passed my exams, and went to work for a contracting firm that eventually became a company I was a part owner of, which is a sentence that took 20 years and more early mornings than I can count to become true. I worked in construction, in residential, in commercial. I have wired hospitals and schools and ordinary people's kitchens. I have been on rooftops in July and in crawl spaces in January and in basements that smelled like decisions previous homeowners had made and deeply regretted. I have done this for 35 years. My hands show it. They're not soft. They have the specific texture of hands that have held tools and wire and conduit, and the kind of work that doesn't come clean in the first washing. My son Daniel, who became a cardiologist, has hands that are smooth and precise, the hands of someone trained to be still and exact. I noticed this at his graduation from medical school. I noticed it the way you notice a thing that makes you proud and makes you a little aware of distance at the same time. I paid for those hands. Not entirely. Daniel worked hard, studied hard, earned scholarships, took loans. I'm not saying I paid for everything, but I am saying that when the gaps appeared, which they did and which they always do, I filled them. Every time, without hesitation, without keeping a ledger, because that was not the kind of father I wanted to be. Undergraduate tuition, living expenses for 4 years of medical school. The car he needed when the residency hospital was not on a bus line. The laptop when his first one failed 3 weeks before an important rotation. The month's rent when the fellowship stipend hadn't started yet and his bank account was at zero. Every time there was a gap, I was there. I didn't loan it. I gave it because he was my son and I had worked 35 years, and the whole point of working 35 years, the whole point of the calluses and the bad knee and the 14-year-old truck was so that my kid didn't have to start his life with the weight of owing his own father. My wife Carol passed away 8 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, which is the kind that doesn't give you much time to prepare, though we tried. She was 54. She had been a school librarian for 22 years, and she loved it with a completeness that I always found beautiful. The specific love of someone who has found the exact right fit for who they are. She kept a list of books she wanted to read after she retired. The list was 4 pages long. She got about a third of the way through it. I am telling you about Carol because she is central to this story in ways that don't always announce themselves. She was the one who wrote the cards, who remembered what everyone liked and made it specifically for them, who called Daniel every Sunday without fail through all 8 years of school and training, and who cried quietly on the phone with me after those calls whenever she sensed he was overwhelmed, because she was the kind of mother who absorbed her child's stress into herself, so he didn't have to carry all of it. She was also the one who, in her last 6 months, when she understood how things were going to go, made me promise her something. She made me promise that I would stay close to Daniel. That whatever happened, whatever the distances became, I would keep showing up. She said, "Ray, he's going to need you in ways he doesn't know yet. Just stay close." I promised her. I meant it at the time the way you mean things you promise dying people. With your whole self, with every intention of keeping it, without fully understanding what keeping it would cost. Daniel was in his second year of residency when Carol died. He came home for the funeral and stayed for a week. He was devastated, genuinely, completely devastated, in the way of someone who has just understood that their mother was mortal and that this specific woman will never pick up the phone again. I held my son while he cried. He was 29 years old, and I held him like I had held him when he was 7, and I told him we were going to be okay. Then he went back to his residency, because that is what residency demands. And I went back to a house that had Carol's reading list on the nightstand and her handwriting on the grocery whiteboard and her specific absence in every room. I grieved alone. I want to say that clearly, not as an accusation, just as a fact. Daniel was consumed by his training. I did not ask him to come back. I did not ask him to call more. I had made a promise to Carol, and the promise meant I did not add my grief to his load. I worked. I went to grief counseling for a while, which Cliff's wife Patricia suggested, and which helped more than I expected. I kept the house. I kept showing up. He met Vivian at the end of his residency. She was in hospital administration, sharp, articulate, very good at reading a room. I met her for the first time at a dinner Daniel arranged in a restaurant that was significantly more expensive than the ones we used to go to together, which I noted and set aside. She was poised in the specific way of someone who has thought carefully about how they come across and has been successful at it. She was polite to me, asked about my work, my neighborhood, my background. I answered honestly. I said I was an electrician. I said I'd been in the trade 35 years. I said I was proud of it. She nodded in the way people nod when they are filing information rather than receiving it. Daniel looked happy. That was the main thing. He looked the specific kind of happy that comes from being with someone who matches your ambitions, who moves at the same pace, who sees the same future. I was glad for him. I did not make anything of the filing information nod. I told myself I was reading too much into a first dinner. They married 2 years later. The wedding was beautiful and expensive, and I contributed to it without being asked how much I could manage, which I noticed but did not raise. I wore the suit I had bought for Carol's funeral, which sounds grim, but which was the best suit I owned and which Carol had picked out, and I danced badly at the reception and toasted my son and meant every word of it. After the wedding, things shifted in small ways that I kept explaining away. The Sunday calls became monthly. The monthly calls became calls when something was needed. Daniel and Vivian moved into a house in a suburb 40 minutes from me. A large house, in a neighborhood where the lawns were professionally maintained and the cars in the driveways were newer than anything I had ever owned. I visited a few times and felt, each time, the specific discomfort of someone who has been made to feel like a category. Not unwelcome exactly, but placed, filed, the way Vivian had filed my profession at that first dinner. Daniel was always warm to me in person. I want to be clear about that. He had his mother's warmth underneath everything. But Vivian managed the household, and Vivian managed their social world. And when Vivian was present, the warmth had edges. It knew where it was allowed to go and where it wasn't. The practice was Daniel's idea, which had been gestating since his late residency years. He had always wanted to run his own thing eventually. His own cardiology practice, private, the kind of place where you controlled the quality of care and the environment and the patient relationship. It was a good dream. A real dream. I understood it the way I understood my own part ownership in the electrical contracting firm. The specific satisfaction of having built something that was genuinely yours. The financing was complicated. Private medical practices require significant capital to launch. Equipment, lease deposits, staffing, licensing, insurance, systems. The number Daniel was working with was large enough that the bank financing only covered part of it. He came to me, and I need to be precise about this. He came to me directly, sat at my kitchen table, explained the situation clearly, and asked if I was in a position to help. The amount was $95,000. I want you to hold that number. Not because it is unimaginable, I know it's a significant amount of money. I know it very well because it was my money I had been accumulating for decades against my own retirement. It was not all I had, but it was a significant portion of what I had, and what I was being asked to do with it was give it, not lend it, because Daniel and I did not do ledgers, because I had always filled the gaps, because that was who we were to each other. I said yes. Of course I said yes. I said yes because it was my son, because Carol had asked me to stay close, and this was staying close, because I had spent 35 years accumulating the capacity to say yes to exactly this kind of thing for exactly this person. I said yes, and I meant it. What I asked for in return, and I remember this clearly because it was almost nothing. It was the smallest possible return on $95,000, was to be there, to be present, to see it open, to stand in the building my work had helped make possible, and feel what a father feels when he watches his kid open something real. Daniel said, of course. He said, obviously. He squeezed my shoulder and said he wouldn't have it any other way. The money transferred 3 weeks later. That was in the late spring. The practice was scheduled to open in the early fall, September. They had targeted, pending the final licensing approvals. Through the summer, I heard updates intermittently. The equipment was arriving. The staffing was being finalized. A medical billing company had been contracted. It was all moving. I tried to stay appropriately in the background. I did not call every week. I did not insert myself into logistics that were not mine to manage. I trusted that when there was something to tell me, I would be told. At the end of August, I called Daniel on a Tuesday evening to ask about the opening date. I want to put in my calendar. I wanted to arrange to take the day off, or technically, since I was semi-retired, arrange my week around it. I wanted to be there. Daniel didn't answer. I left a message. Easy, light, no weight in it. Hey, it's Dad, just trying to get the date for the opening so I can plan around it. Call me back when you get a chance. He didn't call back that evening. The next morning, Vivian called. I don't know if Daniel asked her to call or if she took it upon herself. And in some ways the distinction matters, and in other ways it doesn't, because the outcome of the call was the same regardless of who decided to make it. She was pleasant in the way that is not warmth, but is the architecture of warmth. She said she was returning my call on Daniel's behalf because he was in the middle of final inspections. She said the opening was scheduled for September the 14th. She said it was going to be a private event, an invitation-only reception for colleagues, referring physicians, hospital administrators, and the practice's initial patient referral network. I said, okay, and what time should I be there? There was a pause. Vivian said, Raymond, this event is really geared toward the professional community. The guest list is very curated. It's the kind of thing where everyone in the room will have a specific professional context, medical credentials, hospital affiliations, that kind of thing. I said, I don't follow you. She said, I just think it might be uncomfortable for you in a room full of physicians and administrators. It's a very particular kind of environment. I said, Vivian, are you telling me I'm not invited to my son's opening? Another pause. Then she said, with the specific crispness of someone delivering a decision that has already been made and is not up for discussion. We need the event to reflect the practice professionally. Everyone there will have credentials. It wouldn't make sense to have. It just needs to be a certain kind of room, Raymond. I'm sure you understand. I stayed quiet for long enough that she said my name again, to check if I was still there. I said, I understand. I hung up. I sat at my kitchen table in the house I have lived in for 27 years. The house Carol and I chose together, that Daniel grew up in, where his school photos are still on the wall going up the stairs, kindergarten through high school graduation. I sat there and I felt something I've been trying to find the right word for ever since. It was not quite anger, though anger was in it. It was not quite grief, though grief was in it. It was more like the specific feeling of looking at something you have been looking at for years and finally seeing it clearly, the way your eyes adjust in a dark room and what you thought were shadows turn out to have shapes. The shape was this. I was not his father at the opening of his practice. I was a man without credentials, a man who worked with his hands, a man who would make the room look wrong. The $95,000 had bought the room. I just wasn't allowed in it. I did not call Daniel. I want to be clear about that, because some people in my life, when I eventually told them pieces of this, suggested I should have called immediately, should have confronted it directly, should have made them account for it in the moment. Maybe they're right. But that Tuesday morning, sitting at my kitchen table, I was not capable of a conversation that would have been productive. What I was capable of was sitting very still and thinking very clearly. And what I thought, with the specific clarity that comes when the noise finally stops and you can hear the signal underneath it, was this: how long has this been the truth? I started going back through the years. Not looking for a case to build. I was not trying to convict my son. I was not trying to be right. I was trying to understand. I was trying to find the moment when the relationship shifted from something genuine into something I had been maintaining with money, while the genuine part was quietly replaced with something else. I thought about the wedding, the way the budget conversation had never happened, the way my contribution had been assumed rather than asked about. I thought about the house they had bought, the lawn maintenance neighborhood, the professionally curated surroundings, the kind of property that had required a down payment neither of them could have assembled without some version of help, though I could not say for certain where that help had come from. I thought about the practice, the $95,000. Daniel sitting at my kitchen table and asking for it with the ease of someone who has never had reason to believe the answer would be anything other than yes. I thought about Carol, about what she had asked me to promise. Stay close, Ray. He's going to need you in ways he doesn't know yet. I thought about what staying close had cost me across 11 years. Not the money, or not just the money. The grief I had processed alone, so I wouldn't add to his load. The Sundays I had not called because I didn't want to seem needy. The way I had made myself small in his new life because his new life had edges that seemed to know where I was and wasn't supposed to fit. I had been staying close. But close to what exactly? Close to a financial relationship that wore the costume of a family one. I called Cliff that evening. He came over, and we sat on my porch the way we had been sitting on my porch for 15 years, and I told him what Vivian had said. All of it. Exactly. Cliff is a man of few words, which is why his words tend to land. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What are you going to do about the money?" I said, "I was just going to give it to him." Cliff said was, past tense. I said, "I'm thinking about it." Cliff said, "Think clearly, Ray." Not angry. Clear. That's the thing about Cliff. He doesn't tell you what to do. You just make sure you do whatever you do from the right place. I thought about it for 3 days. I thought about it the way I think about big decisions, without rushing, letting it sit, checking it in the morning when I was fresh and at night when I was tired, because the same decision looks different at different times, and if it looks the same at all times, then you can probably trust it. At the end of 3 days, I had not changed my mind. The money was not going to transfer. Not because I wanted to punish anyone, though I will be honest and say the word punishment crossed my mind, but because giving $95,000 to people who consider my presence a liability was the specific kind of thing I was no longer willing to do. Not because I couldn't absorb the loss financially, though $95,000 is $95,000. But because money is also a form of language, and what giving it would have said was, "It doesn't matter how you treat me. The support continues regardless. There are no terms to this relationship because I have agreed to have none." I had agreed to have none for 11 years. I was renegotiating. September the 14th came and went. I spent the day at work, a wiring job in a new residential build. The kind of day that is physical and technical and that keeps your mind on the task at hand, which was what I needed. I came home. I made dinner. I watched the kind of television that you watch when you're not really watching anything, just filling the room with sound. I did not look at social media, but my sister Darlene texted me a screenshot she had found anyway. The practice opening. A photograph posted on Daniel's page, or possibly Vivian's, I couldn't tell. A well-lit room full of people in formal clothes holding glasses of something. Daniel in the center, smiling the smile of someone who has arrived at a moment they've been building toward for a long time. Vivian beside him, hand on his arm, the precise posture of someone who has arranged the room and is satisfied with the arrangement. The room looked exactly like what Vivian had described. Credentials, affiliations, professional context. A certain kind of room. I was not in it. I looked at the photo for a while. Then I put my phone face down on the coffee table and sat in the quiet of my house and thought about all the mornings I had gotten up before 5 to be on a job site. All the February mornings in particular. The ones where the truck took 3 tries to start and the coffee from the gas station was terrible and the work was cold and careful and necessary. All the mornings that had accumulated into 35 years of work that had become school fees and residency cars and wedding contributions and $95,000 sitting in my account. I was not angry at the photograph. I want to be clear about that. What I felt, looking at it, was something quieter and more final. Something like, I see it now. All of it. I see the whole shape of what this has been. 6 weeks after the opening, Vivian called again. I knew when I saw her name on my phone that this was not a social call. The timing was too specific. 6 weeks is long enough to seem like it's not about the opening, but I knew about the opening, I knew about the timeline, and I'm 61 years old and I've been doing business for 35 years, and I know when someone is calling about money. I answered. She started with pleasantries. How was I? How was work? Had I been getting out enough? I answered briefly and waited. Then she said they were having a cash flow issue. Not catastrophic. She was careful to say, not catastrophic at all, just a timing issue. The practice insurance reimbursements were running slower than projected, and there were some operational costs that had been higher than the initial estimates. And they were looking at a gap in the next 30 days that was creating pressure with the building's financing arrangement. The bank was asking questions, is what she was saying without saying it. She said, we were hoping you might be in a position to accelerate the investment. The 95, as we had discussed. If we could get that into the practice account in the next 10 days, it would give us the cushion to manage through. I let a moment pass. Then I said, Vivian, I need to tell you something, and I'm going to say it calmly because I think that's the only useful way to say it. She said, of course. I said, the money isn't coming. Silence. I said, when I agreed to invest in the practice, I understood it as an investment in something I was going to be part of. I was going to be at the opening. I was going to see it in person on the day. That was the return I was asking for. Not financially, just as a father. The chance to be there. She started to say something. I said, please let me finish. She stopped. I said, you called me in August and told me that the opening was a professional event and that my presence wouldn't fit the kind of room you were trying to create. You told me, without quite saying it directly, that I didn't have the credentials for the room that my money had helped build. I want you to understand that I heard exactly what you said, even the parts you didn't say out loud. I said, I've been filling gaps for Daniel my entire adult life because I believed I was doing it for a relationship, a real one, a father and a son. What I have come to understand over the last few months is that I have been filling gaps for a transaction, a comfortable, well-maintained transaction that used the language of family without the substance of it. And I'm not angry about it. I'm done being angry about it. But I'm not going to put $95,000 into that transaction. I'm not able to do that. She said, Raymond, this is completely unreasonable. You made a commitment. I said, I made a commitment to my son, not to a practice that considers me an embarrassment. She said, that is a gross mischaracterization of. I said, you told me I wasn't educated enough to be in a room. Those weren't your exact words, but that was the exact meaning. I've had 3 months to sit with those words, and that is what they meant. The call ended shortly after. She tried several more approaches, appeals to Daniel's well-being, references to the staff who had been hired and would be affected, suggestions that I was being emotionally reactive. I let her speak each time. I didn't engage with the arguments on their own terms because the arguments were beside the point. The point was not whether the practice deserved the money. The point was whether I was going to fund something that had told me, clearly and politely, that I didn't belong in it. I said goodbye and I hung up. I sat in my kitchen for a long time after that call. Not triumphant. I want to be clear that what I felt was not victory or satisfaction. It was something more like the specific exhaustion that follows something you've been dreading for a long time. You get through it, but getting through it costs something. I felt the cost. Daniel called 2 days later. This was a different kind of call for Vivian's. Vivian's had been strategic and managed, and I had respected the effort even as I held my ground. Daniel's call was none of those things. Daniel's call was a 38-year-old man who was frightened and furious, and who had not, I could tell immediately, slept properly in several days. He said I was sabotaging his life. He said he couldn't believe I would do this. He said he was my son, I was his father, and a father didn't pull the rug out when it mattered most. I let him go for a while. He needed to go. I could hear Carol in him, underneath the anger. The same quality his voice had gotten when he was overwhelmed, the same slightly too fast cadence of someone running out of road. When he stopped, I said, "Are you done?" He said he was. I said, "I'm going to say this once, and I'm going to say it as calmly as I can, because this conversation is hard enough without me being heated. Will you listen to me the way I just listened to you?" He said yes. I said, "I've been your father for 38 years. I worked every day of those 38 years at something I was proud of, but that was also hard, and that cost me things. I paid for your schooling. I filled the gaps every time, without a ledger, without asking anything back except to be your father. When your mother was dying, I managed that alone so you could focus on your training. I have never, in 38 years, asked you to choose between your life and me." I said, 2 months ago, your wife called me to tell me I wasn't the right kind of person to be in the room at your opening. She didn't say it in those words, but that is what she said. And I want to ask you something, Daniel, and I want you to answer me honestly. Did you know she was going to make that call? Silence. I said, "I'm not asking to punish you. I'm asking because I need to understand the shape of things." A long pause. Then he said, very quietly, "I knew." I sat with that. He said, "She was worried about the perception. The event had a certain profile, and she was worried about the optics of—" I said, "I know what she was worried about. I'm asking whether you knew. And you've told me." I said, "Daniel, here is what I need you to understand. I'm not withdrawing the money to hurt you. I am withdrawing it because I finally understand what my role in your life has become, and I am not able to keep playing that role. I have been your funding source for a very long time. I have not been your father for a while. Those are different things." He said, "That's not fair." I said, "I know it's hard to hear. I'm not saying you're a bad person. I'm saying we built something between us that got away from us. And I think we both know it. And I think we've known it for longer than either of us has been willing to say." The call ended without resolution. He was still angry when we hung up. I understood the anger. The anger was not the wrong response. The anger was what happens when something you have counted on stops being available to you, and you're not yet at the place where you can acknowledge that you're counting on it was part of the problem. That place takes time. The practice did not survive the year. I learned this not from Daniel, but from Darlene, who had kept loosely in contact with Daniel's broader circle in the way that sisters-in-law sometimes do. The bank had been patient for a while, and then had been not patient, and the cash flow problem that Vivian had described as not catastrophic had turned out to be catastrophic, or close enough that the distinction was semantic. They had tried to restructure. They had tried to find another investor. The practice closed quietly in late winter, which is the specific kind of closing that doesn't make announcements because no one involved benefits from the announcement. A few weeks after that, Daniel and Vivian separated. I don't have detailed information about the separation. It is not mine to have. What I know, which is only what Daniel eventually told me himself, is that the closing of the practice had been the occasion for a long overdue accounting between them. That some things had been said that couldn't be unsaid. That Vivian, who was effective and clear-eyed and always knew where the edges were, had decided the edges of this particular situation were not workable for her and had drawn her own line and walked back across it. I did not feel satisfaction about any of this. I want to say that clearly because I know it would be understandable if I had, and I'm trying to be honest. There's a version of this story where I feel vindicated by the collapse, where the failure of the thing I refused to fund feels like confirmation that I was right to refuse. But what I actually felt was sadness. The specific sadness of watching something you cared about fail and knowing that the failure was probably survivable, but that the surviving was going to be costly. My son had lost his practice. His marriage was over. He was 38 years old, and he was starting from a different kind of zero than the one he had started from at 22. He called me in March, about 6 weeks after the separation. Not the call I had been half expecting, not the call to talk about the practice or the money or Vivian. Just a call, on a Sunday evening, which was when he used to call his mother. He said, "Hi, Dad." I said, "Hi, Dan." And we talked. Not about the practice. Not about the money. He asked about Cliff, and I told him Cliff's hip had been bothering him. He asked about the house, and I told him I'd had the gutters replaced in the fall. He told me he was working at a community hospital on the other side of the city, a temporary position, filling a staffing gap, general cardiology rather than the specialist private practice he had been building toward. He said it was busy and underfunded and the hours were not structured the way private practice hours were structured. He said, "It's actually, I don't know, Dad. The patients are different. The situation they're in is different. It's hard, but it's different." I said, "Different how?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "They really need me there. Not as a credential, just as the person who shows up." I held that for a while. He came for dinner 2 Sundays after that call. I made the pot roast Carol used to make, which I have made approximately once a year since she died, on occasions that feel significant enough to warrant it. I'm not as good at it as she was. I know this. I made it anyway. He sat at the kitchen table. The same kitchen table where he had asked me for $95,000. The same kitchen table where he had sat doing homework in the 90s. The same table that has been in the same spot for 27 years. And he ate. And we talked. And at some point in the evening, he looked up at the wall and said, "You still have the school photos?" I said, "Of course I do." He got up and went and looked at them. All of them, kindergarten through graduation, the way they go up the stairs. He stood there for a while. When he came back, he sat down and he said, "I need to say something and I need you to let me say the whole thing before you respond." I said, "Okay." He said, "I knew about the call. Not just that Vivian was going to call. I knew what she was going to say." I had agreed with her reasoning. I had told myself that the event needed to be a certain thing and that you being there would. I told myself I was managing the professional context. But what I was actually doing was he stopped. Started again. What I was actually doing was deciding that the perception of the room mattered more than you being in it. And I have been trying to find a way to understand why I made that decision, and I can't. I can't find a reason that makes it okay. There isn't one. I waited. He said, "I think somewhere along the way I started thinking of you as the person who solved problems. The person who filled the gap when there was a gap. And I stopped. I didn't stop loving you. I need you to know that. But I stopped thinking about what it cost you. Not financially. The other costs. And I am sorry. I am genuinely and completely sorry." He looked like his mother when he said it. The particular quality of sincerity that Carol had, the kind that doesn't perform itself, that just sits there plain and open and asks for nothing in return. I said, "I know." He said, "That's it." I said, "I've been waiting for it for a while. I don't need to make it bigger than it is." He laughed. A short, genuine, slightly wet laugh. He pressed his hand over his eyes for a second. Then he picked up his fork and kept eating. That was 6 months ago. He comes for dinner most Sundays now. Not every Sunday. He misses some. The hospital schedule is genuine and unpredictable, but most. We have fallen into the specific, comfortable rhythm of 2 people who know each other well enough not to need to fill every silence, who have been through enough together that the silences are not awkward, but just the natural breathing of a relationship. He asked me once, a few months in, whether I would ever have given him the money. Whether, if things had gone differently after September, I might have changed my mind. I thought about it honestly. I said, probably not. By the time Vivian called me about the cash flow, I had already thought it through. But I want to be honest with you. If you had called me yourself, if you had been the one to call and say what was happening, things might have been different. Not the money, maybe, but the conversation would have been different. I was waiting for you to call. He said, "I should have called." I said, "Yes." He said, "I let her manage it." I said, "I know you did. We'll let that sit." Then he said, "Can I ask you something else?" I said yes. He said, "The practice failing, and I know this is a strange question. Do you think it needed to happen?" I thought about that for a long time before I answered. I said, "I think some things have to fall apart before you can see what they were made of. The practice was built on something that wasn't solid. Not the medicine. The medicine was solid. You're a good doctor. But the rest of it, what it was supposed to mean, what it was supposed to prove, that part wasn't solid. And things that aren't solid eventually show you that." He nodded. I said, "You're doing good work at the hospital." He said, "It doesn't pay like I thought I'd be making at this point." I said, "No." He said, "It feels more like medicine." I said, "That sounds right. I'm sitting on my porch writing the end of this." It is a Sunday evening in early autumn, and the light is the specific amber color it gets at this time of year, the kind that makes even ordinary things look considered. In about an hour, Daniel is coming for dinner. I have made the pot roast again. I have gotten better at it over the last 6 months, which Carol would have found either gratifying or mildly threatening, depending on her mood. I think about her a lot these days, not with the sharp, specific grief of the years right after, but with something warmer and less clean, the feeling of someone you have carried so long that the carrying becomes part of your posture, just the way you stand. I think she would be glad. Not glad about the practice, not glad about the separation, not glad about any of the hard parts, but glad about Sunday evenings, glad about pot roast, glad about the school photos on the wall that her son looked at in the kitchen light and stood in front of for a while. She asked me to stay close. I stayed close through all of it, even the months when close was the wrong shape, even when staying close meant holding a line rather than crossing it. I don't know if that's what she meant. I don't know if withdrawing $95,000 was what she had in mind when she made me promise. Probably not, in the specific sense. But I think she understood, better than anyone, that staying close to someone means being honest with them. That you cannot actually be close to someone you are afraid to disappoint. That real closeness has a spine to it, or it's just proximity. I am 61 years old. My hands are still calloused. The left knee is still bad. The truck is new now. I finally replaced it last winter, after 17 years, which felt like a small extravagance and also felt completely right. It is the first vehicle I have ever owned that started reliably every single morning, and I cannot tell you how much pleasure that small, reliable thing brings me. My son is coming for dinner. The light is amber. I kept my promise. Edit. Several people have asked about Vivian. I genuinely don't have much to say about her. Not because I'm protecting anyone, but because my feelings about her are less complicated than people might expect. She is someone who was very clear about what she valued and made decisions accordingly. I respect clarity, even when it costs me. What I hope for her is whatever honesty looks like in her own life. That's all. Edit 2. Daniel, read this. He texted me after and said, "You were going to tell me eventually, right?" I said I hadn't decided. He said the pot roast part made him cry, and that Carol's recipe was better than mine. He's not wrong. He's also not wrong that it's getting closer.